Hello. Wow, that's loud. Can everybody hear me? Thanks, y'all. Thanks for coming to this panel we put together with a big, heavy hitter list of experts on messaging, communications, policy, on the broader tax fight, broader shutdown conversation that we find ourselves having today. Just want to remind folks that this is an off-the-record conversation with friends and partners to kind of really delve deep into where we've been, how did we get here, and how do we set the stage for the conversation moving forward on not only the tax fight, Republican messaging on spending, but broadly, where are we standing in our economic message and how do we kind of set the agenda moving forward? Sounds good? With that, I'll introduce my panelists. We have Michael Linden, formerly of the Office of Management and Budget. We have Joel Payne to my left, Chief Communications Officer of Move On. We have Kitty in the middle, Acting Executive Director for Groundwork Collaborative. We have Naveed Shah, Political Director of Common Defense. And we have Kate Berner, former Principal Deputy Communications Director for the White House. Thanks for joining us, folks. So we'll start off with where we've been, right? And kind of setting the stage here. We've been in this shutdown moment a couple of times, right? Centering around kind of large policy fights or debates. 2013 was about the ACA. 2019 was about the border wall. And now we find ourselves in a place where we're kind of fighting to preserve programs and push back against these proposed cuts, draconian cuts really, that Republicans want to make to programs that Americans hold dear, to make way for kind of tax cuts for their friends, billionaires, and wealthy corporations. But can we start with grounding this in the 2017 tax fight and how that's kind of shaped our language for how we're thinking about taxes, spending, and how like the progressive ecosystem has coalesced around the issue since then? And I'll look to Michael and Kate for this.
There we go. Hey. Sure, I can start. So I should say that in the 2017 fight, I was working with the Not One Penny Coalition and Tax March. Folks might remember back in 2017, there were a lot of marches. That was an appropriate reaction to a very inappropriate time. One of those marches was around the issue of taxes and tax transparency and tax fairness. And then that turned into a campaign against the what became known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA, or the Trump tax giveaways, the Trump tax scam, lots of different names for it. But what I really remember going into that fight was a couple of things. One, I think there was a prevailing conventional wisdom at that time that this was an issue that Democrats were going to lose. Taxes, not a traditional winning issue for Democrats, certainly not in the sort of political conventional wisdom that as I remember, that this was an issue where folks remember back to the Bush tax cuts way back in 2001, 2003, and a lot of Democrats actually voted for that. Not a majority, but a significant number. It was a bipartisan. It turned out to be a bipartisan tax law, at least at the beginning. And so I think people went into that fight thinking this is going to be tough. On the other hand, if you remember, we'd just come off successfully defeating the Republican effort to repeal the ACA. And I think people sort of also thought going into that was going to be hard to beat back because that's what they campaigned on. And so there was a little bit of this like, well, this is a bad issue for Democrats, but maybe, the president's weak, Trump's weak, he's not popular, but tax cuts are popular, so this is going to be tough. And one of the things that we found, even way back then, not that far back, but back then, was the public view of taxes was a little more complicated than that conventional wisdom. And we had just gone through 15 years of increasing inequality, of tax cuts that were skewed to the wealthy. There was this sense that the economy was not working for working people. And if you look at the data, and other people here are much more steeped in the polling than I was, or I am, it really jumped out in the data that actually the thing that people were really frustrated about in the tax code was that rich people and corporations were getting away with something. In fact, there were more people named that as their number one concern about the tax code than their own tax bill. Don't get me wrong, nobody is excited about paying more in taxes, and except for me. You have to be careful about the way you talk about these things, but the bottom line was that actually people did not like the idea of massive tax giveaways that were skewed to the wealthy. And so the campaign really grabbed that one nugget and said, we're going to make this all about just don't cut taxes for rich people. That was the simple message. Not one penny in tax cuts for rich people. And look, they passed the law. We shouldn't get over, it shouldn't be over praiseworthy here. They passed the law. It was narrowly passed it, and it was the most unpopular law ever passed that we have data for. And every single Democrat voted against it. Every single one in Congress voted against it, which was a major, major shift from when the Bush tax cuts happened. And then Democratic candidates ran on it in 2018. And President Biden ran on it in 2020 and continues to run on it. And so I do think there's been a pretty important shift in the thinking around taxes. Taxes is no longer this, let's not talk about it. If Republicans call you a tax and spend Democrat, you just curl up into a ball and go home. That said, I still think there is some, and we're going to get into this, I do think there's still some reticence to use this as a wedge issue when I think there's a real opportunity, and we can talk more about that.
So I don't really remember the 2017 tax fight because my brain has like a gerbil at this point. But I think I agree with what Lyndon said, and I think one thing I would really want to add on that is what we saw in 2020 was the most important thing that we could say was that the president wasn't going to raise taxes on anyone who makes under $400,000 a year. There were no, we couldn't say that enough. We couldn't repeat it enough. We couldn't put in enough ads on enough lit. It's critically important. And I think what we have to remember, and sometimes the progressive movement doesn't always grasp onto this, is, and Joel maybe, the Navigator folks may tell me I'm wrong here, is people still don't really like taxes. And I think this is what Lyndon was saying. But they like tax fairness. So this idea that a company is paying $0 in taxes despite making historic profits, they think is wrong. This idea that a hedge fund manager is paying a lower tax rate or a lower tax bill than a teacher or a welder or electrician, that is something that they really disagree with. And we see this, it was a huge issue, as Lyndon said, in 2020. The campaign in the White House are making it a huge issue now, right? This is the centerpiece of the Maganomic economic agenda, is extending and expanding the Trump tax cuts. So, if there are any research folks in the room or policy wonks in the room, maybe earmuffs folks, but we can't let ourselves get tied up now in this, well, maybe we want to extend the middle class part of the Trump tax cut. We don't have to worry about that in our comms narrative and messaging. We are against extending the Trump tax cuts. We're against expanding them because they disproportionately benefit the wealthy and profitable corporations. And what Democrats are going to do when we have control of the Senate and the House and the White House again is make sure that middle-class families don't pay a penny more in taxes, while the super wealthy and corporations finally pay their fair share. And that's the messaging that I think started in 2017, which, look, we lost that fight because we lost the White House and we lost the House and we lost the Senate, and there's only a certain amount of things you can do when that's what happens in an election, and that's why it's important to run on these issues and vote and get everyone to vote. But I think that messaging is really critically important, and I think you'll continue to hear it a lot out of the president. You'll hear it a lot next week in response to the Simi Valley-Reagan debate. But it's important that we make this distinction between tax fairness and taxes overall, because unless you're Michael, you're not excited about paying your taxes, no matter how much money you make.
I'm happy to turn it back over if there are more questions, but on this piece, I think I'd echo everything that's been said, although I actually will push back a little bit that there's actually some pretty good social science research that you are so right to focus on fairness, because actually people will say that they would be happy to even pay slightly more in taxes if they felt like the wealthy and corporations were paying their fair share. And so that fairness piece really dovetails very nicely with how people think about their own taxes and why they rank making sure that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share above their own tax bill. And the other thing we see in those polls is, for a very long time, there's been a focus on tying revenue to the things it pays for. That's not wrong. But when you're talking about revenue from the wealthy and corporations, just raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations polls better than the versions where you then tie it to popular spending programs. And I think that gets at one of the drivers here is this sense of fairness. And, I'll say, I think it was absolutely right to step back all the way to the Bush tax cuts when talking about the 2017 tax cuts. And one of the things in messaging that I think has also really changed the debate is I think that for a long time, partly due to the incredible influence of the huge amounts of money being poured into this issue from the right, a lot of Democrats and people on the left really shied away from talking about the villains. And it was seen as, and to some extent, I think we still face this, that it can be seen as uncouth or decredentializing, right? And we saw this in work on inflation, that the verdict is really in. Corporate profiteering was a huge driver of inflation. It is not at all surprising. It shouldn't be controversial. But saying that, it got ridiculed as greedflation. And I think in the tax space, we have a new set of leaders who are willing to really take this on. And it's a really important piece of the puzzle. You can't fall into the trap of being unwilling to talk about the extractive practices of corporations and wealthy tax cheats. We're working, in addition to TCJA, we're working on IRS modernization money, right? And there, it's really important to talk about the fact that these tax prep corporations are predators. And if you're not willing to name it and not willing to talk about how their millions and millions of dollars in lobbying expenses are a big part of the reason that we have difficulty ensuring that the IRS is fully funded, then you're missing the part of the story that I think really resonates with people.
Just add quickly, because I agree with a lot of what's been said here by my colleagues. I'm going to pick up on Michael's point about conventional wisdom. I think that's such an important thing to center this around, because when I started in public service and politics in 2005, the conventional wisdom was so different on this. And it's been because of the work of, frankly, a lot of the folks in this room and kind of doing a lot of narrative shift work to help folks understand why the issue got, translated through public messaging the way that it did. I actually think that a lot of folks on our side, and maybe the professional class on our side, kind of missed the boat that we won the culture war on this. We kind of won the war on it, and I think we're all maybe just starting to realize it. I don't think anybody wants to take a victory lap per se, but I think there does need to be kind of a reanalysis and kind of a reawakening and be like, oh wow, okay, the positioning on this is different. So as a communicator, I can approach this issue with my constituencies and with the public at large differently now because we won the culture war. And look, from my perch, leading communications for an organization like Move On, where we have a giant cadre of progressive members, just kind of leaning into that. So much of this work for a lot of my career has been from a defensive crouch. And then I think now it is not from a defensive crouch, it's from a proactive crouch. And I do think that's just such a sea change that I think it's worth saying out loud sometimes.
You know, in 2018, I was knocking on doors in Virginia, working to organize veterans after what had happened in 2016. And I heard directly from constituents that the tax fight made a big difference to them, that they wanted to see change because of how they felt it was so unfair. And so that, I think, made a huge impact in that blue wave in 2018, helping to shift the narrative. And I think what we're seeing right now happening with the UAW strike, they're doing a fantastic job of naming that villain. They have put, and I don't know if they did this on purpose or how they set this up, but the CEOs of Ford and the other car companies going on TV and talking about their salary and how trying to justify it is not working out for them. I don't know if anyone's told them that, but it's really not working. And the unions are doing a great job of showing that they're not trying to take the company down, they're just trying to get what's fair. And every move the company has made has been in bad faith. So anyway.
I know we have to move on, but one thing I just want to say, and I'm the Biden Democrat in the room, is I think that what you just said is really important, though, is they're not trying to take the company down. The president says this all the time. He says, I'm a capitalist. I want you to have a great idea, make a lot of money, but then you have to pay your fair share. We want to be, especially when you're talking to independent voters, we want to be a country where Ford, you know, we can create cars that we sell around the world, that we create chips that are needed in everything from phones to, you know, Vitamixes. But this idea that you can both be a capitalist and believe that we should have great American companies, but still that workers or working family and working people should get a fair shake on that, I think is a really important nuance and distinction for us to always have in our democratic messaging.
We're killing you in, but this is the good conversation. I mean, I completely agree with you, Kate, and like I'm a big proponent of the idea that taxes as an issue is a winning issue because of fairness, but also because of growth. And if you look at the polling and you ask, if you give people, and this, it's been a little while since I did this, so maybe Ian, you should tell me if this is still true, but a few years ago, if you gave people a list of like different ideas to improve the economy, taxing rich people would always pull near the top. And I'm not sure if you did a focus group, people would be able to exactly articulate why it was that higher taxes on the rich would be good for the economy overall, but I do think it gets to an intuitive sense that things are not working at the top, that stuff's getting stuck there, it's like it's not as innovative, there's hoarding, there's, in economic parlance, there's rent seeking. This is Kitty's academic background, she could talk to you a lot about this. But they get that if you actually have a fair tax code, it's not just about fairness. It is about fairness. Fairness works really well. But you can absolutely prosecute this case as a pro-growth, pro-innovation, strong economy agenda that works more for working people from the middle out and the bottom up. I can't remember who said that. And I do think that that's really important. And I think that those things go together, and we shouldn't think of them as in tension. And in fact, I think that there's a wide swath of voters who want that to be true. They want it to be true that a fairer tax code is good for the economy. So let's tell them that it is. There is actually a lot of evidence that it is, so we don't have to lie, which is always better. But I really think those things go together, and I think they're both important.
Yeah, I think to Kate and everyone's points here, the polling undoubtedly shows that it is tax fairness, right? Over the summer, we have Navigating the Battleground. It's a new vertical for Navigator where we're taking 60 competitive House districts and doing polling there. And specifically, we wanted to talk about Republicans kind of re-upping the Trump tax cuts. And the two most concerning punches we had on it, both over 70% of voters saying they're, of battleground voters specifically, saying they're very concerned. The top one, which we'll get into in a little bit, one, how taxes pave the way for cuts to programs that are important, right? If we're not funding these programs, kind of that pay-for argument that we were touching on. The top argument there is these tax cuts will lead to cuts to Social Security and Medicare and veterans benefits, et cetera. Right behind that, in very plain language, we say in 2020, I think, FedEx and Nike paid $0 in federal income tax, and that just crystallizes it for voters. It makes it pretty clear. Another example is in focus groups last night, to the point of it kind of being amorphous, and we really having to, coming out of this, hopefully in the future, give voters a framework to talk about these things. There's a man who in Omaha, Nebraska, who couldn't put his finger on it, but something's not fair. And I can't afford X, Y, and Z, but for some reason corporations are making more profits than ever and paying less in taxes. And it was something that he could specifically call out as kind of like what's broken here.
That really speaks to me, because I just think there's an incredible opportunity for progressives to prosecute an economic case and to say, whose side are you? It's a whose side are you on moment. And there's nothing more concrete to voters than taxes, right? It's very, very simple. It's very, very clear. Everybody pays taxes. Not many people like it, but everybody pays taxes, and they think everybody should be paying their fair share. And if we're struggling to break through on an economic message, or if you have some other sets of issues that are adjacent to or part of an economic message, incorporating a clear tax component of that is going to amplify whatever you're doing, because you're going to say, it's going to make it super clear. There's a lot of debate right now on which side is trying to claim the mantle of like economic populism or for working people, but which side is trying to cut taxes for billionaires is really clear. And we should be saying that over and over and over again.
And not just which side is trying to do it, but what is their number one priority, right? It's like that is, everything else is just a show. That is what they're here for. They have shown that through their actions. And, I think I could talk all day about how actually taxing the rich and corporations is good for the economy. And I think it's such a good example of a place where at Groundwork, we are really working on changing the narrative about what drives a strong economy. But there has been this multi-decade long con trying to take people's basic intuitions, things like, yeah, if the CEO takes all the money, there's less for workers. And say, no, you're actually wrong about that because I put a bunch of stuff in a model and like there would be more jobs if it were this way and we gave all the money to the rich people. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about this moment as an advocate, and that I think we should all bear in mind, is I think that President Biden has a unique understanding as far as like Washington consensus goes here. I think that he is much clearer on these issues, and you're seeing it in every budget that Michael and Kate helped put together. And
I want no part of that.
Right, but they, all of the campaign proposals to tax the wealthy and corporations are in the budget every year. And that's not a given in Washington. And I think that it is because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my brief experience working with then Vice President Biden, I think that he has a good nose for bullshit on some of these issues. And I think that extends to, you're seeing it with the UAW strike. And, I think we should all lean into this moment where there are willing partners in the policymaking apparatus to tell this story. There is fertile ground to sow these seeds because it is in fact both true and what people believe to be true. And the thing that tends to hold us back is not public opinion. It is the disconnect between public opinion and legislative action on issues that affect the bottom line of the wealthiest and most powerful people in this country. And breaking through that and running on these issues and making them central to kitchen table conversations, I think is the way forward into a holistic, more prosperous economy that delivers for workers and families through public investment, through a fairer tax code, through worker empowerment. And I think the tax piece is a really critical piece of it.
There we go. We're good. Thank you all. And I think we wanted to kind of set the stage there to talk about Shutdown. if folks have been under a rock, we're on the precipice of a shutdown. I do want to say first, let's not take it for granted that only 11%, in our latest poll, only 11% of the electorate says they're following the shutdown closely. And when we're thinking about what the electorate is paying attention to, I personally, I'm not going to speak for Navigator, this is Ian speaking, I personally look to that top box number to see who's really engaging with the issue. So this is why this panel is called Shutdown and Beyond and broader tax fight. Like, we really need to talk about how this one moment kind of ladders out to broader priorities. With that being said, we just came off the debt ceiling fight. In both fights, similar to the 2017 and 2018 fight, we have Republicans kind of staking their ground in cutting programs, cutting budget, cutting the deficit, and really going after programs that voters hold dear, right? And how do we frame this fight when we know that the voters actually are not only opposed to cuts, they're actually, for things like the child tax credit, in favor of actually expanding how much we spend there? But how do we kind of fight back against this brand of democratic spending while also really landing the plane on the shutdown specifically, where Republican priorities are? And just interested to hear y'all's feedback on that. We can start with Joe.
I think we just turn on the microphone and hand it over to Kevin McCarthy and his band of merry men. I mean, look, we were kind of small talking about this before the event started. This has been such a unique moment because I think for the first time, it's almost like Republicans are narrating their own desire to do this. Like, we tried to do the narration for them at several points and at different stops in our careers in the past, but they're doing it, and it's almost like it's funny. It's like you've got the Matt Gaetzes and that crowd that wants to throw in these kind of culture war riders, and then you've got the like deficit hawk crowd, and it's like they're fighting. And it has nothing to do with Democrats, with our priorities. I think the president and his team have been pitch perfect. I think Leader Jeffries has been pitch perfect on allowing them to self-immolate and really making it plainly clear to the public. You know, the split screen that I know that our friends at the White House are very keen on showing. You know, when the president talks about the almighty versus the alternative, you just look at what's going on Capitol Hill. It's the best illustration of it. So I think in this moment, what jumps out to me is how Republicans have really kind of taken the cloak and dagger off and are just doing the narration themselves, which is unique for all of these budget battles I've seen. I mean, look, I go back, I worked for, the late Majority Leader Harry Reid, with some of these fights back in the day where we had to do all kinds of jiu-jitsu because the public was in a different place, or maybe the public wasn't synthesizing the issues the way we wanted them to. That's different now. The rules of the game have changed.
So I totally agree with Joel. We will win the shutdown. First off, I think it's really important that we, at this moment on September 21st, remember we're not going to just win the shutdown on its own by default. These are hard. These have been hard fights when shutdowns happen. We're going to have to work our butts off. The White House, Jeffries, Schumer, they're going to have to work really hard to pin this on the House Republicans, as crazy it is right now. And that's because of that number Ian had of only 11% are tracking this. We will win the shutdown by defining the congressional Republicans, and particularly House Republicans, as an extreme MAGA party of chaos. I completely agree with Joel on that. And they've given us plenty of fodder, and the digital videos produce themselves. Putting that aside, to the kind of broader policy fights, and really this is more where we were around the bipartisan budget agreement over the debt limit, is I think there's two really important things that we've found when we're having a policy fight around budget and spending. Is these fights are they're budget fights. They're not spending fights. The Republicans want them to be spending fights. They want them to be largely discretionary spending fights. though they keep bringing in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for reasons that frankly are beyond me, but have at it, guys. We'll kick your ass in 24 as a result. But we have to make them, and the president was really focused on this. And if you remember, kind of what he kept pushing as his bottom line, what he wanted to talk about with McCarthy, included taxes. Because if we're talking just about spending, then we're playing on their field, and we're talking about cutting spending or working off the amount of revenue that we currently have. And we have to continue to drive taxes to be part of that conversation. Part of that is also Republicans love to spend through the tax code. We've been trying, I think we tried to redefine it as wasteful spending, but that's everything from pharma tax credits, like managed care, Medicaid. Lyndon will remember the policy proposals better. Oil and gas, that's all money that we're spending. We're just spending them on tax cuts for companies. So that's the first thing I think is like really, really important, that this be a debate about budget, not a debate about spending. And then the second thing, and I really tortured my OMB colleagues about this, and the White House actually just put this out yesterday, is people don't really like spending. They don't like spending a lot of money, billions, millions. It all sounds like a crazy amount of money. And even if people like the result, they don't necessarily like that we're spending X trillion dollars on Y. So we focus on what that's for. So their cuts mean this many fewer DEA agents, this many fewer FBI agents, this many kids who get kicked off of Head Start. And doing that number counting and looking at what the impact of these cuts are is really important. I think we really lose the American people and that independent voter, that kind of moderate voter, we really lose them when we're talking about dollars and cents, and you get them back when you're talking about what the government is using that money for, because as we see in all of the polling and other testing, they like the results. They want the benefit of that program, but they don't necessarily, no one's excited about this huge price tag. And there's different testing, and I don't remember where it's from, but also once you get over a certain number, and my other colleagues, it doesn't mean anything. It's like monopoly money. You've never seen $10 million. You've never seen $100 billion. So, we also the threshold is lower for when we also it just sounds like I'm not going to swear, it sounds like a lot of money to people. So focusing on that impact rather than that dollars amount, I think is really important, as well as the kind of budget, not just spending piece.
And on that note, I just want to note, as a leader in a progressive grassroots veterans organization, that's something we found resonates with a lot of people. Is not just how many billions the Pentagon's going to lose because of this, but rather the soldiers who are currently on active duty are not going to be able to pay their mortgage or their rent on October 1st, and are still going to have to report to work no matter how long this goes on.
Or the wait list at the VA hospital,
right.
that triples.
Exactly, and those are the kind of stories that really resonate with people that we've seen and really works to bring it home. So I think that's a really good point.
Real quick, if I can interject, Naveen and I were just talking about this before we got on. In our most recent poll, we did statement pairs, lovely polling exercise everybody loves. But we started off with a Republican argument, spending, deficits, cut, balance, et cetera. The best testing argument against Republicans' point of view here was how much this actually affects. Obviously, we have Social Security, Medicare, SNAP, but when we bring in veterans there, it's the top performing message. By 18 points, we beat the Republican attack on Democrats for spending. 30 points among folks who, at the beginning of the survey, blame both Democrats and Republicans if we would go to a shutdown. So very powerful there.
And actually, I wanted to follow up on that and just sort of translate what folks have just said into some, in case you ever think that all this stuff doesn't matter for actual policy, I just want to tell a quick story, because the one area, if you look at the debt limit deal, which has pros and cons, I think it was the greatest deal ever negotiated in humankind, but it has pros and cons. But what a lot of people don't know about, or didn't pay much attention to, is that deal actually included over or close to $50 billion in actual new spending for the Toxic Exposure Fund, for the PACT Act in the Veterans Health Administration, which Republicans did not want to fund. They had been underfunding it deliberately, and they did not want to fund it, and we got them to put in almost $50 billion of real money. That's not an authorization. It was an appropriation of $50 billion. Why? And I am going to swear here, because we beat the shit out of them on this topic, because we made it very clear. We said their Limit, Save, Grow, Default on America Act would mean 33 million fewer outpatient visits for veterans. And we hammered this on, and people in this room worked on the outside game to make sure that the voters knew about this. And I'm telling you, in the room, Republicans did not want to fight on this topic. They really, okay, veterans, we don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about something else. Because they were getting hammered on it. So if we can hammer them on an issue that is 18 points of, in our favor, and taxes are pretty close to 18 points in our favor, like we actually can translate it into policy victory.
Well, and you also took it out. We hammered them so hard that I'm going to brag for him, that Lyndon and Shalonda, Director Young, got it taken out of the discretionary context too. So it didn't even, we hit them so hard on this issue, and Vote Vets, there's anyone from Vote Vets, did an absolutely phenomenal job, that it was so uncomfortable for them, what they were doing to veterans in this country, that we got the money to fully fund the PACT Act and to do all of this without cutting into the discretionary column, so we could hold that money for other Democratic priorities.
And last thing I'll say on that note is, when that vote was happening, it looked like for a minute that it wasn't going to pass the Senate. I've never seen our members mobilize so fast. Within an hour of sending the message that some of them might vote against it, we had 1,000 members call their representatives in Congress to tell them they need to vote on this burn pits bill immediately. So.
Just to echo a few of the things that have been said, on the funny money point, I think it's really important, and it's hard for those of us who work with numbers to really connect with, but I totally agree. I think above like $10 million, it is all the same. And I think that you see this also in the Republican House extremist messaging. They love to talk about their new bill funds the government at $1.74 trillion, right? Or whatever it is, because that number it sounds really big. There's lots of room in there for cutting more, right? And so talking about those real world effects is so important. But I do want to really plead with all of us in the movement that we keep talking about the shutdown fight. This is an appropriations fight. The point is not to avert the point isn't just the shutdown and demonstrating how bad shutting down the government is. The point is to tie that to the policies that are underlying the desire of folks like Matt Gaetz to shut down the government, to tie it to taxes, and to talk about the dire consequences of accepting cuts to these programs. And so, I saw American Progress put out an awesome piece on the individual, here is what will happen during a shutdown. One of the things that really jumped out at me was kids are going to lose childcare because Head Start centers are going to have to close. I think there could be an amazing story on, a TV segment that's not just about that, but about, but a lot of childcare centers are about to have to close because of the childcare cliff. And are they going to be able to reopen if we reopen the government by capitulating to the most radical people in the House and enacting long-term funding cuts in those programs? So I think that's a really important direction to take these things. And I'll also say that while this is a place where I agree, the ads cut themselves, we have a real inside the Beltway elite media problem on anything related to congressional negotiations. And I'm sure that these folks can all come together on the trauma around that. But over the next 10 days, we are going to be constantly facing the narrative, the attempts for people to pop up the narrative of, the Republicans in the House are trying to come to a deal amongst themselves in order to avert a shutdown. And when the story is actually, there was a debt limit deal, that covered appropriations levels. Some of us were not very pleased with that deal institutionally, but we struck it. And the whole point was to not be coming back here. And so that needs to be a big part of the narrative, is just that this is not an issue where people need to come back to the negotiating table. There should be no calls for the president or the Senate, which has passed out of committee all 12 appropriations bills on vast bipartisan margins, right? They've done their work, and that needs to be the narrative, but it is a real struggle with reporters. It's a real struggle with the media.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And just to pick up on that, I think that in the kind of Beltway media class, there is such an inertia towards 50-50 storytelling to no one's advantage. And I think that's a direct result, and this is not what we're here to talk about, but I'll just add this really quickly. After 2016, people were so traumatized by the surprise of what happened in that election and election cycle that they overcorrected. And I think what they missed also is that election was not a vote against economic populism, which is what we're talking about here. We're talking about economic fairness, and we're talking about economic populism. People did not say what the media thought they were saying in 2016, and they've overcorrected. And so it's very important that we offer these critical insights about what we're learning about organizations like mine that are talking to grassroots voters every single day. That's not what they're saying. What you think they're looking for, the kind of vapid bipartisanship and the vapid kind of 50-50 telling of the story, that's really not what voters are looking for. They want fairness, and I think that we framed this the right way, I think.
Thank you. So kind of expanding to now the future past the shutdown, right? Like, how do we make sure that our efforts around the shutdown, our efforts around appropriations, link to our larger bodies of work when it comes to what the Biden administration's passed to help voters? Like, how do we come from this conversation moving forward with our policy agenda and make sure we make that link and take this moment and not just have it be a moment in time, but kind of a springboard to the future, much like how the 2017 tax fight was?
I'm going to start by this is going to sound cliche, but it's also true. Like, these next 2 years are so unbelievably consequential for democracy, for our economic policies. I mean, depending on what happens over the next 2 years, we're going to make some really big choices. Are we going to continue building an economy that works for working people, that's inclusive, that brings people in, that removes barriers that have been put up for so long? Or are we going to kind of go back to trickle-down kind of economic policy? Are we going to try to combat economic concentrations of wealth and power and make sure that people have a real shot at meeting their potential? Or are we gonna just sort of give it all to the billionaires and say, save us, Elon Musk, you're so brilliant? You know, like, what? Those are genuinely the choices that are before us, both in the campaign context, which we're not really here to talk about directly, but also right afterwards, right? The Trump tax bill expires, large chunks of it expire in 2025. So we are at this moment when we have learned some lessons from 2017, and a lot of really smart people and people who are influential have internalized some of those lessons, and you've seen it in President Biden's language, which has been very gratifying to see, and it works. And then we're going into this big fight, and as Joel said, the media wants to make this about some sort of weird who's really the populist and 50-50 and both sides are blah, 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 whatever. And then we're going straight into a major fight about tax policy in 2025, whether you like it or not. Whether you're a tax policy person or you're not, your issue is going to be tied up in this. It is. Do you care about Social Security? Do you care about Medicare? Do you care about healthcare funding? Do you care about racial and economic justice? Do you care about gender justice? It's tied up in this fight that's coming. So we may as well win it, because we have to. So I guess all of that is a preamble to say, like, we have an opportunity. We can see taxes as an opportunity to prosecute a case that's going to pay major dividends, both in 2024 and beyond. And I really would urge all of us in this room who think about these things and who are connected to this issue in different ways. Some of us work on this all the time. Some of us only see it as a tangential issue. Taxes is an issue that's going to be in the 24 campaign. It's going to be an issue in 25. If we all make it a central part of our argument to the American people, I really think there's a huge opportunity here to define it in a way that's going to pay enormous dividends.
Say something super quick. Trump's already calling his shot, right? With the 15%, the corporate tax rate piece. He's already like laying it out there for us. And I think, in terms of like the issues, like maybe next to abortion, I think framing that in the larger like kind of Maganomics versus Bidenomics piece, I just think is so critical. But just saying that over and over again, and not just for saying it because, Kate, to your point, I think we have to really deploy those types of statistics for people in a way that's digestible, not just saying it as these empty stats. It's what they're going to spend the money on, right? Because it's really, they don't have an aversion to spending. Trump told you, they don't have a problem with spending. It's what they're going to spend it on and what their priorities are, and that's gross to the American people, and it's been proven. We've put it up, and they've lost on it. We've kicked their butt on it, and we've changed the conventional wisdom around it.
I think that's totally right. I mean, and that was the point I was making on like tax spending is spending, right? They're gonna take that and spend it on oil and gas cuts, and like there's like weird tax loopholes for crypto. But I think we talked about this a lot kind of in the first section when we were talking about 2017 is there's a million reasons why what happened in 2016 happened. But a huge piece of that election was about populism and whose side are you on. And I agree with Joel that the media is obsessed with this both sides and this political process. But I do think it's really important that we win in 24 and going into the to frame up the tax fight about whose side are we on. We're on the side of working families. That's part of the tax fairness debate. It's a huge piece of, after the Inflation Reduction Act was, the messaging was that Democrats and the president took on special interests and won. Donald Trump tricks people into believing that he's on their side while he advocates for policies that hurt them. It's why he's going to Michigan next week to stand with a bunch of labor workers while he attacks UAW and says that people shouldn't pay their union dues. And oh, by the way, we could just make those cars in South Carolina, which any person who's ever worked on an assembly floor in Michigan knows what the hell that means. So it's critically important that we, drive forward on what his policies would mean, that he is a phony populist, that Republicans up here, they can say one thing, but their policies hurt working people. They raise costs for working people. They lower taxes for the rich, but maybe increase them for families, or they increase the proportionality. I think that's really, really important for us as we kind of go into this next phase. It's really the center of what Bidenomics versus Maganomics is, right? Bidenomics is bottom up, middle out. Maganomics is top down. As we talked about earlier, people kind of intrinsically understand that trickle down didn't work. There's tons of economic research. I don't know that is necessarily the most persuasive on the doors, but Joel is smiling, so I think he agrees. But they know in their selves that it doesn't work. Then the last thing I would say, and I think this is something that I would love Navigator to work on and in focus groups, is I think that tax cuts is a really hard phrase for us. People like tax cuts. They don't want to, we've been talked about this. People don't necessarily want to take taxes. So it's, we always think about it's the Trump tax giveaway, the Trump tax scam. Saying the Trump tax cut for the super rich is not necessarily the best soundbite for us. So what is, as we go into this fight, as this is going to be, this and studying Social Security and Medicare seem to be their only, and repealing the Inflation Reduction Act seem to be their only economic platform going into 24. So, how are we going to define this in a way that isn't repeating Trump tax cut over and over again, which I think could really dangerously backfire?
I think we should call Kate before we write every survey for my Navigator folks in the room. To that end, in our last battleground survey, again, when we were litigating Republicans re-upping the Trump tax cuts, when we asked initially before messaging, strictly, do you want Republicans to re-up wasn't the word we used, I'm in DC right now, re-up the 2017 Trump tax cuts, majority support, I think 59 to 41, right? But once we kind of go through and talk about Nike and FedEx and talk about what this is going to mean or Republicans' plans to cut Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, we flip that, right, to about a 20-point deficit for the Trump tax cuts. But I think that exactly that, just giving folks a raw read on a tax cut is going to be problematic if we keep it right at that definition.
And look, we're all friends here. This is what Republicans do better than Democrats. Democrats, when you look at polling or anything, and you see this when you talk, when Democrats are explaining, we win. When we explain our policy, when we explain the benefits, Republicans, when they have that like 200, whatever Elon has us at now, 280 character, 15-second digital ad, they win. And we have to work really hard over the next 18 months to make our 15-second digital ad version as good as theirs, because their soundbite version sounds real good. And it's when you peel it back that you realize it's screwing over everyone you grew up with and know from your life.
Both of those points really emphasize to me, like, look, I care about this issue a lot. I looked at all the polling. I know that the American people are on our side on this issue, but we're not going to win on it unless we prosecute the case, unless we actually go out there and fight on it. And if we fight on it, we'll win. We do need a really good 15-second ad. We really do need a good soundbite, and I think we can absolutely get there. There's lots of smart people who know how to do this. But if we say nothing, if we just assume that it will be fine, we're going to lose. Because people are going to start from that place of tax cuts. That sounds pretty good. But we can prosecute this case and win big. And that is the key thing. That's why I call this an opportunity. It's not sitting back and let the issue win for us. But it is a huge opportunity, but we have to take it.
Yeah, and I think, in addition, like prosecuting it and sticking the landing and convincing policymakers to stick the landing. So the place where I think it's really where the economic research comes in is, I'm going to keep harping on this, but there is an extraordinarily well-funded, multi-decade inside the Beltway campaign to decredentialize ideas that are common sense, that the American people agree with, and that's what I think the research side can push back against in a very inside the Beltway way, so that the folks who need to just say, billionaires are ruining the country and we're going to stop it, will believe it in their hearts. And I think there's no better example of this than there is no constituency for Social Security cuts. Like, I think all of us are up here just bring it on, my friends, every time that we hear, the crazies in the House talking about, or, Paul Ryan is having a fireside chat at the Hamilton Project. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it is a shift over the last 10 years that those of us who've been in this world have been doing this work, that we are no longer opening every conversation with, well, we do have an entitlements problem. And we've really come around, and I think the president is a part of that. But again, there are hundreds of lobbyists going to the Hill, inviting members of Congress to tax prom, contributing. Club for Growth contributed like $100 million to campaigns in the 2022 election cycle. It is our job to fight back against that, reveal that, and make policymakers understand that it's not going to work any longer for them to dance around saying the things that they need to say to connect with the American people, because they don't want to be seen saying those things by the industrial complex of takes about how we need entitlement reform and deficit reduction and that sort of thing.
And on that note about entitlement reform, that's something that I heard a lot about is people who are on food stamps and things, they're just lazy, they don't want to work. 25% of military families are on food stamps. Are we saying that they're lazy and don't want to work? Absolutely not, right? That changes the entire conversation. So I think a lot of what you said is true, and when you start bringing these conversations up with them in that way, and actually being able to flip those arguments upside down, they don't have a good comeback or hot take for it.
I think one thing I'll say, it might be a little inconvenient. Your point, Kitty, that is an inter-party problem. That's not just Republicans. That there's so that's also a thing just to kind of keep in mind.
I don't work for the Democratic.
No, for sure. But I think the point I would make is maybe to link it a little bit to what's happening in political space right now. We've seen groups like No Labels, and they have a lot of money flowing into them. And a lot of that money is coming from the part of the political power class that has felt pushed out, or that feels like they're a little bit alienated in this moment. And I do think that's worth putting voice to. That is an inter-party phenomenon, and I think it's just worth saying.
We've all been agreeing so much, so I don't want to dive in on deficit reduction. But what I will say, something that the president does really well is he flips these Republican talking points onto them. So do we move on and talk about deficit reduction? Then let's talk about deficit reduction. The president has put forward a plan to reduce the deficit by more than any of the congressional Republicans, and he's done that while investing in working families and protecting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the safety net. It's all a choice about how we do that. The president put forward, Lyndon will remember, was in the budget, a very bold plan to extend the Medicare trust fund. And that was not by cutting benefits or raising the eligibility age. It was by decreasing the amount of money that you, the taxpayer, pays to big pharma, who made more in 2022 than they'd ever made in history. So I don't think that, look, this is not where we should go to win the fight in the election or in the tax bill. But I think as we think about some of these issues that are traditional Republican talking points, we can fight and win on those issues. We have better policy that are also more popular and better politics, but we have to not accept their terms of that debate, right? There's ways to extend the life of these programs that, oh, by the way, you've already paid into since you were, 16 or 14 and got your first job, without abandoning our values. And there's ways for us to cut the deficit, which there is some data that, folks in some of these places, and we see in this Congress, we need to win everywhere to get out of this maelstrom and protect our democracy and continue to build an economy that works for working people. And we can do that. We can cut the deficit without cutting programs, while extending the child tax credit, while expanding EITC. It's all about the choices we make on who is paying low taxes and who's paying high taxes in order to do that. And that's, someone mentioned earlier, the president always included these tax proposals in his budget because he believes that with a fair tax code, we can fund our priorities and make significant progress reducing the deficit. And what was our 10-year deficit reduction number? Nearly $3 trillion.
It was over 10 million, and nobody knows
Exactly.
the difference.
That's right. It was $10 million.
It was very high. It was very high. Listen, I'm not going to disagree. And folks who know me know deficit reduction is not what gets me up in the morning. And we can have we should have another longer conversation in some other spaces about like whether we really need it from an economic perspective. And there's all sorts of interesting things to talk about here.
Everybody's availability next week.
That's right. Deficit reduction panel, you guys in? But why I think I'm going to come back to this and say, first of all, like, again, this is why the tax issue is so important. If what you care about is climate change or racial justice or gender justice, tax policy is important because of how our economy works and what we can use to fund that, fund green energy tax credits. If you're a swing voter who does care about, if you're the one swing voter who cares about deficits, or maybe like just two. We can talk. This is one place where we disagree. But if that is a thing that you think you need to say in a place where you need to, have some credibility on that topic, guess what? The entire reason why the deficit today is higher than it was expected to be 20 years ago is tax cuts, thanks to the Center for American Progress analysis on that point. But it is true, if you go back and you look, why do we have higher deficits today than what was projected 20 years ago? Tax cuts is the entire reason. So if you want to get serious about managing our long-term fiscal risks, like the president does, you're going to need to talk about the tax code. You need to talk about fair tax code. You need to talk about tax spending in the tax code. That's never going to be my primary message. Like, I don't think that's not going to be my thing that I think like we need to get out there and win on that issue. But because this tax issue touches so many things, you can win on every single one of these things with a really simple message. Tax rich people. Tax them more. They should be paying fair taxes.
I think all of that's right. And I will say that one of the reasons that I think I do blanch a little bit when we talk about deficit reduction is I think it's a good example of a place where you are absolutely right that the president, I think, has adopted the correct pivot away from deficit reduction or, embracing it, but then talking about the wealthy and corporations paying their fair share. I read the social science literature as pretty clear that deficit reduction is not the thing that actually motivates voting behavior. But when I talk about the kind of like deficit reduction industrial complex, it is unmasking that all of that stuff, all of your Maya McGinnis stuff, is about cutting benefits and cutting taxes for the wealthy, and that's all they care about, and that's what they are together on, and everything else is epiphenomenal. And there's a very clear reason. It's because the people who fund all of that work have billions of dollars to lose personally from the outcomes of these conversations, and so they are willing to put billions of dollars into getting their way. And that's why I think it's really important to constantly be reminding folks that there is no constituency for cuts to Social Security. There is a huge constituency for taxing the wealthy and corporations. I want us to just like over and over say and corporations, because one of the things I'm worried about with the TCJA conversation that I think we're all going to need to work on is exactly what Kate was saying earlier. If we are back in 2012 land where we're taking the expiring provisions of the TCJA, which is only the individual side, the corporate tax cuts are permanent, and putting them in buckets, this we're going to keep, this is going to go, this we're going to keep, this is going to go, we have lost the conversation. And what we need to be doing is pivoting to that messaging that you were describing of, we are not going to allow wealthy tax cheats and corporations to keep getting away with this. That is not what we are about. We are here for you. We are not here for them. And the corporate piece is something that I hope that we can all start talking about much more, because we could repeal the corporate tax rate cut right now. We don't have to wait for 2025, and if 2025 comes and goes, it will not happen automatically. And the president's budget has consistently had an increase back up to 28. But that is really fertile ground. It is something that people are with us on. I think it's really important to talk about it right now when we have been talking about living through a corporate profiteering-driven bout of inflation. The president is doing a great job working that in on the UAW stuff, right? And we need to make people really stick to, do you believe in worker organizing and power, or do you not? Do you believe that corporations need to pay their fair share in taxes, or do you not? And we need to start having that conversation, not wait for the expiration date to start coming.
Thank you all. Amazing conversation, and I love how we were able to progress through like the base of this conversation really all the way through how we move forward. And I just really appreciate this group of experts taking a time out of a super chill, not busy fall week to come chat. So thank you all. Quickly, I think we have a couple minutes for a couple questions for folks if they have them for anybody on the panel.
Thanks. I have a question. I'm not sure exactly to whom I should direct this question, but I was really struck, Kadi, by something you said about the messaging around Sorry, I took some notes. Let me pull up my note here. You had a note around the fact that messaging that's just about fairness and doesn't talk about sort of the very popular programs taxes pay for pulls better. It pulls better when you're just about fairness and not sort of pivoting to the litany of programs. From a coalitional perspective, as we get ready for 2025, it's easier for single issue orgs to see themselves in a fight when you've pivoted to the list of programs. How do we square that? Like, how do you galvanize organizations across the progressive spectrum who are focused on a multitude of issues without listing the programs that taxes pay for in your sort of top line messaging?
It still pulls really well with the programs. So I don't think you should be like overly worried about that. I just say it because I think that there is a conventional wisdom that people aren't motivated by taxes, don't care about tax fairness. And so we have to talk about the programs, and it's two great tastes that go great together, not like, ooh, we have to sweeten the gross medicine of taxes with the sweetness of the programs. And I think that's important to understand. Like, people are here for tax fairness. They are here for making the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. They understand who is screwing them over, and we need to talk about that.
I don't have great advice on the coalition management piece of this, and Joel, I'd be curious to hear what you think on that. But I think what's also important for us to remember, and what's important for us to remind various groups and group leads, is that baseline message, though, is critically important. If we don't bring taxes into the budget conversation, and if we don't wind up with more revenue, we cannot, we're just, whether it's a real voter issue or not, we're not going to be able to spend money on what we think needs to be spent. So this, to me, is a foundational, critically important fight. So if you're a single issue organization and your issue isn't taxes, but it's childcare, your issue is taxes. And you should use the best polling message to win on taxes, because we are not going to be able to make that investment in childcare. We're not gonna be able to beat the Republicans on the Hill to do it, and the mods in our own party, to get that done if we do not get, and that is why the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, like, you know, if you think about the moment we're in right now with the debt limit agreement and the shutdown and appropriations now, it is because they starved the US Treasury of money. They successfully did that. Receipts are lower as a result, and now they can say, well, we can't afford this. Well, the reason we can't afford this is because they gave rich people and companies a hugely lower tax bill. So I just think it's really important, and this is me as the political communicator, is like, maybe doesn't fit your coalition, your organization mission in the best way, but it is the most important thing for us to win on this fight so that we can then go win all those other fights.
Give it over to other folks, but just to double click on that, they didn't do that by accident, right? Like, the whole point of the Reagan tax cuts was to starve the beast and shrink the government, right? This is the point of what they're doing. And, you know, the work that Center for American Progress put out recently showing that the extension of the Bush tax cuts was the beginning of our budget problems, it should also really frighten us, because those problems are big. I'm not at all trying to pretend that that's not there. And, you know, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with is that, and again, the problems aren't spending. That's not the issue. But the Fed's interest rate hikes have really changed the deficit picture. I was on the phone for an hour with a Wall Street Journal reporter a couple of months ago on this exact topic, that there are things outside of our control that are going to make this look worse. And I don't think that we should focus on that as the message, but you're exactly right that it is politically unsustainable to continue to have revenues that fall so far short of our country's needs. I will also say that when we're thinking about the shutdown we keep talking about like 2013, remember that we have already suffered through sequestration. We are already, we have cut government investments over time because of this stuff. And if we don't bring up revenues, it's all going to be the coalition's fighting amongst themselves for scraps. And that can't be the world we live in.
And just one last point from the polling perspective is, at Navigator, we're always trying to, this wasn't a Navigator poll, but same thing applies, where we're always trying to kind of be careful with what the chart is saying to the end user, right? And we kind of don't want to paralyze people with the top punch, where it's like, oh, saying this like this is the only way to say it. Really, there's a tapestry of the ways you can explain things, especially when you're talking about a specific audience, right? And a lot of these groups are talking to an audience that is directly engaging with their issue. So whereas, for example, in our most recent survey, the worst punch was, but Republicans promised that they wouldn't come back to the table talking about shutdown. We shouldn't say that. We should stop saying that, right, to the broader electorate. But for something like this, I think it's a little bit more tailored and individualistic for whoever's doing the messaging, right?
What if the message is they promised me personally?
Maybe.
Michael Linden will be very sad.
Michael Linden, no. Haven't yet. We really don't know.
Could be good. Could be a good message.
It's a black box. Yeah,
I'll just take 1 minute to flag that every time someone said Center for American Progress wrote something, they meant Bobby Kogan wrote something. So props to Bobby Kogan for one man cap center. Thanks.
I don't even know if this is a question, more of an observation, and I recognize that this is a discussion on the shutdown and beyond, but just in reference to messaging, we've talked about a bit today, and you talked a fair bit about tax thieves or tax cheats, as I think that we discussed, and Republicans. We didn't talk about Republican tax thieves, and the last two Republican candidates for president were such. So I'm just wondering how that factors in to messaging and beyond.
Look, I think the point Ian made about audience is really important, right? Because your audience is critically important. I think that there is a ton of evidence that from 2016 and 2020 that people don't, I might get chased out of the room for saying this. People don't really, independent or swing voters don't care about President Trump's personal challenges, whether those are tax challenges, legal challenges. They care about January 6th, but that's different than the indictment against him. They care about the impact on their own family. President Biden won because people felt like they'd given Donald Trump a chance, and it didn't work out for them. Their neighbors were losing their jobs, COVID was mismanaged, the economy was being rigged for super wealthy and Wall Street, and not the businesses in their community or working families like themselves. And we lose sight because we get fascinated by the stories about their taxes or Jared and Ivanka's Saudi deal or China deal, and we get caught up into that. But we have to remember our audiences. So we have a turnout audience, folks who are trying to drive to the polls, and maybe some of this is helpful for them. It's motivating to them to go knock on doors or make calls. And then we have the folks that there are still voters that change their mind election to election. And we also have to turn out those folks. And those are the reason, independent voters are the reason that we won the House in 2020. They're the reason that we stemmed losses in the House in 2022. If we want to hold on to some of the tough seats that we have facing this Senate race in 24, we're going to have to hold on to them. So I think it's catnip for us, and it kind of goes to the same like elite media. It's catnip to focus on Trump's taxes or this or that, but at the end of the day, they're worried about themselves. They're worried about their own family making ends meet. I think that's why Biden connects with people so well, because he's focused on their kitchen table, the kitchen tables around the country and the challenges that people are going through. And we just have to be careful to not fall into this trap. And it's hard right now with the 4 indictments, but to fall into this trap of talking about results for you and your family and the values you care about, whether that's democracy and the fundamentals of who we are as a country, and not, you know, the page 6 Politico version of it, which, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of tip sheet readers in this room that we so easily get caught up in.
We have some polling on the issue of wealthy tax cheats, and I do think it's really important that that is not Donald Trump's taxes, because I totally agree that, and in fact, I think that what we know is bringing Trump into it just polarizes an issue that otherwise actually is very good for us. And the reason that I do think that there is a space for talking about wealthy tax cheats is the IRS funding is part of the fight that we're currently fighting on appropriations, and it is incredibly important for the actual policy of being able to actually raise revenue with whatever policies we enact. And so, you know, Groundwork Action has a poll with Economic Securities Project that talks about these issues, that looks at IRS modernization and enforcement money. And we do find that the message of, and again, on priorities and which side are you on, right? Their number one, HR 1 was protecting wealthy tax cheats by gutting IRS enforcement. And we find that that does play well. And, you know, it's important to all the questions about messaging and to what you were just saying about Navigator. You know, it is important to remember that there are multiple audiences, right? We are not all actually engaged in electoral efforts, and also that there are some things where you have to pick your message to be both popular but also fundamentally aligned with your values and where you need to go. And if there's a conflict between those things, you need to go back to the drawing board. But so I think, you know, talking about wealthy tax cheats, corporate tax cheats has a place, but not in this polarizing, personalized way that's focused on Trump, even though, you know, I, as a tax lawyer, was astonished at the reporting on his family's just like criminal behavior. But we do, it is catnip, but keep our eye on the prize, which is all the wealthy tax cheats.
Maybe just to pick up on that a bit. I worked that 2016 Hillary race. I did ads for that race, and if I have one, I have a lot of regrets. If I have one regret, I wish I would have pushed harder for us to not take, I'll speak for myself, I wish in the stuff that I did, I spent less time focusing on how offended I was and how my sensibilities were offended by Donald Trump, as opposed to just being like, he is the same old Republican y'all been voting for your whole life. He's George Bush, he's George Bush's daddy, he's John McCain, he's Mitt Romney, he's every single one of these guys. They've all wanted to do the same thing, take money out of your pocket and put it in the pockets of the rich people that surround them and that advise them. And he did it, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on my colleagues on the Clinton campaign who, there was, like, none of this happens in a vacuum. Like, we were doing some of that. It's just, did that raise up to the level where people really got it? I don't think people got it. We were all kind of in collective shock about what we were experiencing. And I think us as practitioners, we probably fell into that a bit too. And if I had one mulligan, it would be more ads that focused on Trump, the crappy Republican administrator of policy that he told us he was gonna be, and then he did. And if I could have got back in front of voters, particularly black voters, I would have said that. I also think just, kind of one other thing, kind of the downstream impact of like this tax policy thing that we're talking about. And in 2024, one of the groups, or some of the groups that I think if I was cosplaying as President Biden's political team right now and thinking about what they're thinking about, they're thinking about shoring up some of those constituencies, men of color, lower income, who are less trustful of kind of government and less trustful of the machine. There's a long con of downstream impact on those folks, black men, Hispanic men. By the way, softer parts of the coalition that Republicans have kind of been feeding this like long con that you talked about, and that I think is just, again, worth kind of calling out and pointing to in this moment. So there's a lot there, but I definitely think that I think your guys' points are valid about not being distracted, not taking our eye off the ball.
Great. We have one more question.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more directly to the shutdown itself and regarding what you expect to happen. You've brought up how you don't believe that Dems should engage in any concessions, should have a strong message of, we already made this deal, we already enshrined this in the debt ceiling. What do you expect to actually happen, and are there any issues in particular that you expect some Dems might make concessions on?
I mean, yeah, I think our best guess is right now that as of today, earlier today, they weren't able to make a deal on the defense bill. And that was a big thing. House Republicans. Yes, thank you, yeah. Weren't able to make a deal on the defense bill. And that was a big thing last time because that ensured that at least the troops were gonna get paid. And that they weren't even able to come to a deal on that. And so that leaves the door wide open for everything else to kind of go wrong, so.
I don't know what will happen, but I think something Kitty said before that's really important that we have to be careful of is we can't fall into a trap of and let the media push us into this trap of where's President Biden, where's Leader Schumer? The president negotiated a deal, McCarthy agreed to it with caps. The Senate is advancing bipartisan appropriations bills to those caps. So we have to be really careful in the next 9 days to let this continue to be McCarthy and his caucus. And does McCarthy, do a West Wing style deal with Jeffries? I genuinely have no idea how this ends. But we just have to be really careful that we don't pull this, I'm almost even scared to say this into a microphone, that we pull this light onto us because we did our job and and the Senate is doing their job, and the Senate is doing their job on a bipartisan basis. And right now, what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, or since they've come back from recess, as I said earlier, time is a little wooey for me. They can't get anything out of rules. They can't get a bill at the levels they agreed to. They can't get a bill, we'll see. The bill that they negotiated in the basement last night is a further right, more extreme, more MAGA version of the bill that limit, save, grow, the bill that McCarthy had them pass to strengthen his hand in negotiations with the president. And it's not clear from reporting whether they can even whip that. They might be down 7, they can only be down 4. So it's scary and it's gonna hurt for families around the country. And we should take no pride and no joy in what a shutdown will mean for people all across the country, whether they're active members of the military, whether they're parents whose kids aren't gonna be able to go to Head Start. This is gonna hurt. And it's gonna be bad for our economy, and it's bad for our country, and it's bad for our standing in the world. But we McCarthy has to figure out what can get 215 and what can get through the Senate. This is not, we said this all the time during debt limit, it was like it had to be McCarthy and the president. It's like, there's another friggin' house. We gotta get 60 there. Like, it doesn't go from McCarthy's rostrum to the president's desk. That's not how legislating works. So I just think this is very perilous in this moment, but we have to be very careful that we keep this in McCarthy's caucus, where he cannot, despite having the majority, get anything out of his body.
I'm also not going to make a prognostication, but I want to just make a super clear point. In appropriations, typically, you need at the end of the day, you need the agreement of 5 parties, right? House and Senate, and majority minority in both. Generally, that's what happens, and then the president. In this situation, 4 out of the 5 of them, same page. Not a problem. There's an agreement on the top lines. We have a way to get to those top lines. If we need more time on those top lines, we can do a CR, and it's not a problem. 4 out of 5, total agreement. One faction of one party in one chamber is going to shut down the government. And everybody needs to understand that. This is not a negotiation, a failing of deal making. One faction in one party in one chamber is going to shut down the government because they want to make it harder for service members to get an abortion, because they want to cut 80% from Title I, K through 12 funding, because they want to make it harder for states to make sure that drinking water is clean. Like, that's what we should just be saying over and over and over again. And it's not a deal. There's no deal. The deal was done. 4 out of 5 of those parties are ready to go. No need to shut down the government. One party, one faction, one chamber.
And some of them are saying the quiet part out loud to the point of, we have people on Twitter saying, can't wait for the government shutdown. And some of them are doing it not even to make it harder for service members to get abortions, but because they feel like it's gonna play with their voters, right? And we're talking about the House with 1/435th of the electorate, with about half of that. And I just couldn't agree more with everything that's been said, and want to add, like, every time that I read a story where they talk about the Main Street Caucus negotiating with Matt Gaetz, my hackles get up, because it's like over whether they are going to shut down the government or to avert a shutdown. And it's like, it's really unclear what they're negotiating about, because as Michael said, as Kate said, there is already broad agreement on what needs to be done. And it shouldn't matter what this tiny faction thinks. So the real question is, what is Kevin McCarthy doing to hold on to his gavel? Because that's what he cares about, and that's what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd add in that Kevin McCarthy was trading a BS impeachment to keep these people in line, and that didn't work. It didn't work, by the way. That was last week. It didn't work. It didn't make them happy. And if he had any political instincts whatsoever, if he had a scintilla of the political instincts of Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi, he would challenge them to come for his speakership. Because you know what the dirty little secret of that caucus is? The problem is, there's nobody that can have that job. No, like, there's no one else. It's not Steve Scalise. It's not, there's no Paul Ryan riding in on a white horse to come save, Republicans like they did 15 years ago, and that didn't really work out. Like, there's no option, there's no plan B, which is both comical as we sit here, but it's also really scary, because for a long time I've said one of the biggest crises we're dealing with is the inanity of the modern Republican Party, and the fact that they can't get their house in order. and it has downstream effects on all of us, and that's such a great point about everybody else, the Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, House Democrats. There is, you can't get, I mean, you can't get unanimity like that on anything, and it's this part of government that's, you know, really, really putting us, you know, on a knife's edge of peril.
And the reason that they don't put a clean CR on the floor is because everyone would vote for it. It would pass by a very high margin. And that's also the reason that the Freedom Caucus is constantly trying to, you know, extract more from McCarthy. They don't want that thing on the floor because it will pass, because there is no constituency for their stuff.
And this isn't an electoral conversation, and I keep making it electoral, so I apologize. But this is why elections matter, and this is why candidates matter, and this is why we have to work so hard over the next 15 months. Because who is here for the next 2 years is so consequential to people's lives around the country. I believe in voting more than I believe in anything in the world, but it's why we have to work so hard to get folks out. You know, I was thinking, as we talk about the House, it's like next week's panel can be on gerrymandering and like why that's important and why we're in this situation, but it is so critically important that we have these conversations and we think about messaging and we think about policy messaging, but also persuasion messaging and turnout messaging, because we are just at a critical moment in our country, in our history, in the history of the world. We look at what's going on in Ukraine, and Zelensky is here today, and it is so important that we win races in 24 and that we not allow what happened in 16 and what has happened, you know, back and forth. Again, they're going to all be really close races, and we have to remember that. But it's always what I come back to when we're having these conversations, because it just couldn't matter more and have a greater impact on everything we're talking about here today.
Well, I think if anyone has final thoughts, takeaways, if we want to, Michael's ready to go. Okay, I'll pass it back to Ian for any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think we were pretty thorough. Just thank everybody for coming out. Thank you all for taking the time. Really proud to have put this together with this great group of folks. For any research questions, feel free to go to navigatorresearch.org or email press at navigatorresearch.org, and we can get those answered. But thanks, everyone, and enjoy some snacks before you get out of here.